first 30 minutes of a film called Maasai Women, which is, it's a documentary. It's in the same series. If you watched Unca's Big Mocha, it's in that same series, the Disappearing World series. I thought we got most of what we need to do get out of the first 30 minutes. So I posed a few questions about that. And one was just a comparison. We've been talking about food getting systems in this unit. And as you can tell from Maasai Women, this is a classic pastoral society. They live mostly from their cattle. And so if you remember, actually they made jokes when they're bringing that new bride into town. They were like, your husband only doesn't have any cattle. He only has pumpkins, which would be a grave insult if they were, growing food. They don't like to grow food. They like to raise cattle and have their cattle around. So this is a classic, what they call a pastoral or herding society. And then one of the things we've also been talking about is kinship systems. So how are they organizing themselves in terms of their kinship? And here we can see, again, a rather classic pattern of patrilineal descent. Things are being passed down the male line to the extent that women do not seem to have many rights of inheritance, maybe no rights of inheritance. It's a little bit more complicated than that. As you can see in the film, there is the women, as they come in, get to take care of certain cows, and they do have certain rights over cattle, but they don't seem to have inheritance rights. It's also a patrilocal society, so that bride is leaving her mother's village and joining the village of her husband. And we see here definitely some polygyny, or one man being married to more than one woman going on here. And so, there's this really fascinating scene where you have these three young women talking about, and the anthropologist is like, well, here your husband's bringing in a new wife. Are you going to be jealous? And she says, well, no, we're not jealous. There's so much work to do around here. What would we do if we didn't have a co-wife? And she's like, well, can't the children help you? And they're like, no, the children are too silly. They can't help me with all the work that I have. So it's a lot different, I think, than what we would necessarily expect people to say about this. As some of you noted, it is rather dramatic. Now, we might wonder, if there's a difference between what they're officially saying and how they're feeling about things, but it's definitely an interesting scene. And the other reason I kind of like this is it goes back to something we talked about a little bit about what is called female genital modification or mutilation. Michael Gonzalez earlier on say that FGM, or female circumcision as sometimes called, is a maladaptive practice. And I think that I'm not trying to say that they aren't wrong, but it's interesting to hear some of those old women in this film talk about how great a thing it is to have their females being circumcised, and how they've always done it, and it's a great thing, and the woman is so happy to be circumcised and ready to get married. And so, you might wonder what's going on here. And, I guess what I would caution you on this is whenever we say things are adaptive or maladaptive, we actually have to ask, well, for whom is it adaptive or maladaptive? And there can be certain customs in any society which might seem maladaptive, which are extremely maladaptive for some people, but for others, they derive some sort of benefit from that. So it's very important. Again, I would caution you to say that, when we think about what cultural relativism is, cultural relativism doesn't say, okay, now we need to accept this custom because that's what they do. We're still trying to understand what it is, and we still may not want to necessarily be approving of this just because some people say, oh yeah, that's what we've always done, or that's a good custom in our society. The other thing that is interesting to me, back when I used to show this film, and there were it had a video case instead of was on YouTube, is that the jacket for the video said, well, this is a completely male-dominated society. and the women are powerless because of their culture. And I guess to me, and I think one of you noted this in the comments, I mean, I don't disagree that there's definitely a male dominance going on here, but the women seem to be in some ways running a lot of the society, and they seem to be able to acquire power over time, especially if they become a sort of senior woman in that society. So I'm not, I guess I would say that these things are always perhaps a little more complicated than they might appear at sort of first glance. So anyway, these two films are kind of like extra little readings, or we can learn from them and use them to tie together different parts of the course. Are there any questions about the Maasai Women film? Good on that. Okay. All right. So today we are, and I think that both Maasai Women and Anka's Big Mocha are going to come into the lecture today, which is going to talk about politics and political power. But before we do that, and political organization, before we do that, I just want to sort of frame out the kind of big reason why we in anthropology might be talking about politics. So, you might come into this class and think, what am I doing? What are we doing in anthropology talking about politics? Why would anthropologists be concerned with politics and political organization? And so a lot of this has to do with when anthropologists first started doing field work. If you remember back to when we were talking about the idea of culture and the first anthropologists who were doing field work, there was an assumption that only people that look kind of like this were able to do government the right way. And so that these European white American institutions were the ways that everybody did, government laws, and that's the way everything should be done. So people that look like this would have a government, and people that look like this would we would consider them to be not have the same kinds of political or organization. So we would talk about, for example, some people talk about stateless societies as if they are lacking any form of government or any form of political organization. And this comes up to us in some of our ideas that we have, even in the present, when we talk about how, we're going to go over to another country and give them democracy, or we need to spread democracy around the world, as if other people don't have ways of organizing themselves. And I guess today we'll just say that it is kind of funny because maybe we should give ourselves some democracy and not worry about if other people in the world have it or not. But this is the sort of prevalent assumption when anthropology was being formed, is that certain people who looked a certain way had government or had politics and others didn't. And so anthropologists began to try and answer this question. If people out there that were different from the European and American tradition didn't have a state or didn't have the same forms of governments, how is it that they were then able to organize themselves? And so one of the things that people were, as anthropologists were doing their work, a lot of people were organizing resistance efforts to the colonial order. And people were like, well, how are they fighting? Because they don't have, they don't have a state, they don't have a government, they don't have a standing army. How are they organizing resistance to the colonial order? Or how are they organizing various events? So if you think about all the things that Anka had to do to organize his Big Mocha and all those kinds of redistributive feasts that he had to throw, how is it that people organize? One of the first answers that anthropology came up with is that basically in many what we might call non-state societies, or societies that didn't have a centralized government, that they often used different forms of kinship in order to organize their political activities. So, the idea that there would be a kinship based on descent, or what we talked about in terms of lineages, that would help you to organize your people, and you can sort of, especially in a time of conflict, who are you going to draw on first in order to fight somebody? Well, it's probably going to be the people you know best or your close kin. Now, what we need to be careful of is the assumption that, you know, in other societies, in non-state societies, they organize themselves by kinship, and in our own society, we don't care about kinship. We just have, you know, a sort of meritocracy where it doesn't matter who you're related to, and it doesn't matter who your dad is. You know, everybody is equal, and we don't care about kinship so much. So I guess I would caution you there that we can think about how kinship is relevant even in our own society as well. But what anthropology does is give us this idea that if we do field work and we look at what's going on, people do in other places have these institutions in order to maybe have a kind of like a judicial system or a court system, but it might not be apparent. There might not be sort of a written law. There might be, you know, informal ways of enforcing social order. So these are sometimes hard for us to see from the outside, but they actually often work on an informal level. So again, we're still talking about sort of the big lessons of anthropology, is that anthropology tries to understand politics holistically. And we talked about this probably a long time ago, but anthropology understands politics in relationship to the economic system, in relationship to the way people get food, in the relationship to their kinship system. And so what anthropologists do is often challenge the idea that in other societies, people lack something or there's an absence of government. And so again, this has been part of the assumption about other societies, is that they don't have the same institutions, they don't have the same political organization, and therefore they are lacking it. So this is one of the main points of political anthropology, or an anthropology of political organization. The other thing that anthropologists have done recently, more recently, is to bring these lessons back into our own society. So we can see from an anthropological perspective that although some people would like to believe that we live in a meritocracy in which kinship doesn't matter anymore, certainly kinship matters a ton to us. And we just have to look around at today's elections and we can see various family members saying things about others, and who was married to whom, and who was the son of whom, and who is the daughter of whom. Kinship is hugely important in our political system, and also gender. So, you know, I mean, certainly different people, different political figures are treated differently according to their gender identification. This has hardly become less relevant to our politics. In fact, it seems to be almost on the rise, if you might think. And finally, sort of again, getting at the big ideas here, what anthropology does is provide us some tools for analyzing the political organization of different societies outside of simply the formal organization of the state, as well as giving us some lessons about the state itself. So this has been kind of a sort of, again, we haven't yet delved into the specifics of Muckle and Gonzalez yet, because I just wanted to give a sort of larger scale overview of why anthropologists might be studying politics, what we can learn from anthropology and politics in general. So, political organization. Muckle and Gonzalez start out with this idea of how we can separate out what they call coercive power, which in a coercive power is when you are able to make somebody do something. You might have control of the police, or you might have some sort of control of the military, and you are able to not necessarily directly coerce someone to do something, but you can enforce it. And they contrast that with what is called persuasive power, which comes to us in the form of having some sort of, they use these terms of authority and prestige, which kind of can overlap in some ways. They're basically the idea that you have some sort of influence over other people, but you're not necessarily coercing them, or you don't have coercive power over them. And so if you go back to the film Onka's Big Mocha, Onka there is what they call a big man. And he's going around, he's trying to persuade people. But as they say in the film, he can only persuade them. He can't make them do things. He can't coerce them into doing things. And so here we have an example in Macklin Gonzalez that the big man affirms his status with great shows of generosity. And that's what Onka is doing with his mocha. He's affirming that he is a big person, his status, by giving away so much, by being able to marshal up this huge gift and sort of flatten his rivals. Macklin Gonzalez here talk about different ways in which people kind of can influence or control each other in the absence of coercion, in the absence of being able to make them do what they want. And they talk here about what they call internalized controls, which are the kinds of things that function in the sense that they seem natural to us because we grow up with them, and it would just seem weird if we do something wrong, then we feel guilty about it. And so they talk about guilt and shame. And they sort of, I actually think when they say there are guilt cultures or shame cultures, I actually think that's a little bit overstated. As they say a little bit later, they say that all cultures have some use of both guilt and shame across them. So, I mean, these are just ways in which our moral compass is kind of built into us by our culture, so that if we violate the rules, we have this internal feeling that we've done something wrong, and it feels unnatural to us, and we feel either guilty or ashamed of doing it. We can also think about things that people do to keep other people in line without necessarily coercing them. So these can be coercive sanctions, or I mean, you can sort of have ways in which people are penalized for bad behavior. So those would be sanctions. But one of the more interesting ways in which people are kept in line is through gossip. So for those of you who grew up in a small town, or maybe went to Hartwick College, you know that gossip can be used in order to say things about people, in order to keep people from doing things that you don't want them to do, because you don't want to be gossiped about, or you don't want to have that kind of your actions getting out there like that. So this is an interesting example of what are called externalized controls. They kind of often go with internalized controls as well, right? So these all kind of work together, but there's some virtue in thinking about them separately. So the reason this is important is it applies to what Macklin and Gonzalez call uncentralized organizations or uncentralized systems. So these are societies that do not have a state in the kind of classic anthropological typology. These are either the band systems or the tribal systems. And they don't have, we'll talk about what a state is in a second, but these do not have a centralized government. And so we call them uncentralized systems. And so as we've talked about, in an uncentralized system, they tend to prioritize organization that is done by kinship or by lineage. They don't have, like I said, they don't have a centralized state or a centralized government, so they're going to be prioritizing kinship organization. They also often prioritize temporary or informal leadership. So these are people who might be the leader of the group for a time. They're not necessarily they don't have the, it's not that they've gone through an election. It's not that they've been certified to do this. They are simply, because of perhaps their authority or prestige, they are acknowledged as leaders, and they may shift from time to time. And so they may not be one leader for all time. The other thing that in uncentralized systems you see are other kinds of mechanisms for social, for imposing social norms or sanctions, or you might call it maybe a justice system. So there are groups in these societies that function outside of the kinship system, like the age set. So this would be the people in your peer group or in your generation. Don't know if you remember when Laura Bohannon was talking about the article Shakespeare in the Bush, and she was explaining to them the dilemma of Hamlet. And Hamlet wanted to avenge his father's death, and the elders said, no, the younger generation doesn't do anything with the father's generation. What you should be doing is getting his own age set to intervene. So these can be different kinds of groups that have power or authority in this system or in a system of uncentralized organization. Now, what often happened, or what would happen, is that these forms were kind of, again, oftentimes very informal. They would shift over time or be kind of not formalized. And when people who were wanted to colonize some of these societies, the sort of colonial authorities or colonial heads, they often wanted to make this more permanent. So some of the ideas about chiefdoms, for example, and what a chief should be, are actually in some ways imposed upon other societies by colonialism or colonial rule. So that kind of famous, I don't know if it's famous anymore, it sometimes used to show up in movies where somebody would come into another place and say, take me to your chief or take me to your leader. The Europeans often wanted to have these very very formalized forms of rule. And so they would sometimes try to transform what may have been an informal system into a more formal system and try to give them powers that they may not have had under their what we might call traditional society. Muckle and Gonzalez then talk about the role of what a state is. And so now we're talking about a centralized government, and almost everyone in the world now lives in some relationship to a state. So they talk about the state as, if we remember the idea of redistribution, the state is taxing its citizens or collecting tribute from them in order to build things like roads and highways and schools and hospitals and what Muckle and Gonzalez call infrastructure or operations. But one of the main things that taxes go to, and they don't mention it here, is taxes also fund the military, or having some sort of external, some sort of force that will fight external enemies. And they also fund the police, which is obviously trying to internally control the situation. And Muckle Gonzalez, they don't tell us this. You don't have to copy this down, but I want to show you the source of this idea. This idea comes to us from about 100 years ago, the sociologist Max Weber, who talked about the state as a human community that claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And so what Weber was saying here was that when you have a state society, if you have a sort of successful state society, they are the only ones who are able to use force legitimately. So that if I go out there and Jada and I get into an argument and I start being mean, I'm not supposed to be able to legitimately use any form of force. If we're going to have an argument, we have to call somebody else in who is an agent of the state. And so that's what it means when you have a sort of some form of authority in which you can call someone else in, and they are the ones who might be able to, make sure I'm behaving in this situation. So when Muckle and Gonzalez say a state is a formalized central government with the authority to use force, that is actually, it's a very old idea that they're drawing on, a very interesting idea by Weber about having that the state is what has the legitimate use of force or the legitimate use of physical violence within a territory. Now, what's interesting about this is that states, because they want to be the only ones to be able to have legitimate physical force, will, when they take over a territory or maybe under colonial rule, will try to stop people perhaps from feuding with each other or raiding each other. So if you again think back to Uncas Big Mocha, they talk about how in the old days they used to have more feuds or raids between groups, and they get close to a feud in the film, but Unca goes out there and he says, no, this is we're not supposed to be doing that anymore. So oftentimes the state or the colonial government will claim, well, we diminished the violence in the society. We stopped people from, we stopped these kin groups from carrying out raids on each other. We stopped, I think even in our own society. So, even if someone were to hurt a member of your family, you're not supposed to go out there and then sort of take retribution yourself. You're supposed to call in the state to do something. But I mean, even in our own society in the past, it was seen as something you could do. It was seen as something that you might have the authority to do, but the state is supposed to take that over. So on the one hand, that's what states do, is suppress, or they should try to suppress sort of violence within their own society. But when it comes to the military and these large-scale warfare organizations, that's something that states have done more than any other society. So the sort of little raids and feuds that we're talking about in non-state societies are, I guess I would say they aren't a big deal in comparison to the world wars and interstate conflicts that we still see today, when people are bringing in armies and really trying to take over another society. This goes back to something that we learned in the archaeology unit about when warfare comes into the archaeological record. It happens at about the same time that we see these state societies emerge, and not before that. Most state, I'm going to take that back. All state societies, all sort of contemporary state societies, have social stratification. So the idea of inequality, which is somehow, in some sense, made permanent over time. So if we think back to the bands structure, or even some of the tribes, they usually are relatively egalitarian. That is to say, people will have status within them, but they work because people are sharing food, and nobody is getting is becoming too big or too important over another person. So if you remember back to Richard Lee's article on Christmas in the Kalahari, that was what he was saying, is that they didn't want anyone to rise above and think that they were better or a leader there, because in some ways everybody had to share and be equal in that experience. Muckle and Gonzalez talk about, and this relates to what we were talking about in terms of how colonialism and colonial societies sought to make certain forms of stratification more formal. So there are different ways in which that happens. One of the things that happens under a colonial system is that the people who are doing the colonizing will try to set up rules for the people who are being colonized, or the indigenous populations. And as Malcolm Gonzalez points out, and as we've talked about, this often sets up a kind of, the idea is often played out along what then become classified as racial lines. So the idea that, you know, people are biologically different from each other, and it corresponds to the colonial order, and that's the hierarchy that gets set up under colonialism. They mention another couple ways, another few ways, I would say, of stratification. One is the idea of social class. And this is sometimes called achieved status. And so social class is the idea that through your own actions, through your own abilities, you can achieve a higher income, which gives you a higher social class status. So the idea is that it is something that you can move into and out of, so that if you were working class, you can achieve a better lifestyle and become middle class. If you're middle class, you can go up and become rich, or you can go down, so that this is not something that you were born with. And they contrast that with what is called caste, or ascribed status. And in ascribed status, your status is basically something that you were born with. The classic example of caste is taken to us from sort of the South Asian or the Indian system of caste, in which people would have an occupation, and that would be their caste, and those are the people that they would be able to marry within that. And if you were born into that caste, you wouldn't sort of be able to move into another caste, or you wouldn't be able to move up or down. So oftentimes we contrast class with caste, but it's also often interesting to think about, well, are these systems really that different? And if you think about what we talked about in our kinship unit on social class endogamy, or the fact that most people from the same social class end up marrying each other, how many people actually end up moving social class, even in the United States? How much social class mobility do people have? Or in some ways, do we have something that resembles or is more like a caste system? So this is sort of something to kind of just think about as we analyze different societies and their stratification, is how much their stratification is more like in something that you could have social mobility in, and how much it seems pretty much that everyone is in the same status for their lifetime, and they pass on that status to their offspring. A couple of you want to talk, or a few of you want to talk about the idea of gender stratification, which goes well with what we were talking about in the last class about, you know, gender differences and how they then get mapped onto the ideas of power. So one of the points that we should make is that although many different societies do have forms of gender stratification, this is variable across different societies. Some have, and it has different kinds of outcomes in different societies. There's a super interesting article that came out quite a while back by the anthropologist Ernestine Friedel. And the article was actually called, it was actually from 1978, it was called Society and Sex Roles. Probably today we would call it Society and Gender Roles, because she was really talking about gender more than sex. But what she said was, she was actually comparing different hunter-gatherer societies and trying to figure out how much gender stratification were in these different hunter-gatherer societies. And Friedel determined that in some ways, was a super interesting finding that the amount of control that women had over the food supply, and especially the meat, especially the protein, could be a variable in their societies. So in societies in which women controlled, had more control over the food supply and especially over the meat, they tended to be relatively equal or egalitarian. And in societies in which they did not, they tended to be more gender stratified. And what's also, I think, interesting is that she then applied it to her own societies and said, well, it's not that women need to control the meat in our society, but what that means is that for women to have power, they need to have control over resources outside the home or non-domestic resources. And if women have that kind of power, control over resources that are not inside the house, not to say that having control over domestic resources is important, but to the degree that they have control over what we might call the metaphorical meat in a society, they will also have some control over, they will tend to be more relatively equal. So this is, they say, there's some interesting sections on basically stratification in state societies, how they were transformed under colonialism, and how we get these different forms of inequalities that get kind of built into our societies, and how we might compare societies across each other. They have, a couple of you then got into the environment and water, the ideas. We're going to save that. That, I think, goes well with the sustainability chapter, which is coming up in a couple weeks. So we'll just kind of hold those comments for now. I mean, they're interesting passages, but I think they go better into that. There's this funny part. I wanted to mention this because it's kind of a strange little part of Michael Gonzalez, is they're talking about warfare and strife and raids and these things. And then you get to the very last page of the chapter, and all of a sudden, they start talking about cannibalism. And it's like, whoa, where did the cannibalism come from? And I just want to talk about that a little bit, because I feel like they kind of, how to say, I don't always like to criticize the textbook. Usually like to say the textbook is correct, but here I think they kind of got it wrong. So cannibal, the word for cannibal comes to us actually from the Caribbean islands. It was this Carib society, and they were, as Michael and Gonzalez say, they were fighting the encroachment of the Spanish soldiers in their territory. And so, but they got a reputation for cannibalism, and that's in fact where we get the word for cannibalism, is from this thing. It basically was from around the time of Columbus. The reason I think I want you to be careful about this is because Europeans became very obsessed with cannibalism. And so people would sort of go around to different societies when they were under colonial rule, and they'd try to ask people if they were cannibals. And so they were very concerned about this. This usually works better if we're able to do this in class and we can move around and show our mouths and stuff. But you might think about how you would ask someone if they were a cannibal if you can't speak their language. So the Europeans were very concerned about asking someone if they were cannibals, but how do you ask somebody if they are cannibals if you can't speak their language? So if you think about how you would probably point to that person, you'd be like, you, and then you'd mime it, like, do you eat yourself? How would you convey that? And then you think about, well, what is that person going to think about me? If I'm trying to ask them through sign language, basically, miming, if they are cannibals, they probably thought that the Europeans were cannibals, right? And so oftentimes these ideas, because they were kind of a European obsession, and because there weren't any anthropologists around to sort of actually talk to people and ask about that, the idea that other people were cannibals has been really exaggerated. What would happen, interestingly, is that once the people figured out that the Europeans were obsessed with cannibals, they'd be like, oh no, no, we don't do that. But those people over there that we don't like so much, over across the mountains, they're definitely cannibals. Go get them. Go get those guys. And so what's very interesting is, especially under colonialism, cannibalism became a justification for why you should impose your rule on these ungodly heathens, because they're doing human sacrifice or they're eating each other. So it functioned as a justification for a lot of the things that the Europeans were doing, but it also became a way that societies used to sort of manipulate others because they realized it was so deeply important. People would say, oh, well, you know, that's what it's always sort of, oh, that's what we used to be, or that's what the people down the road are doing, or over the mountains. And it can also be used, I mean, and this is an important point at the end of the chapter, is that it is also often used to frighten other people. It's like seen as the ultimate evil. And so you might deliberately say, well, yeah, if you mess with me, I'm a cannibal and you're going to be in really big trouble. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is this is fascinating stuff, but you have to, whenever anybody says, oh yes, they were cannibals in the Caribbean, or they were cannibals in this part of the world, you have to sort of take those accounts with a grain of salt, because there were a lot of different ways in which under colonialism, this was very much misinterpreted just because of language differences, because of the conflicts that were going on between and within these societies. I get a lot of this from a book that was called Cannibal Talk by the anthropologist Gananath Obeyesekere. And, you know, he talks about the man-eating myth. And, you know, a lot of it, it's not to say that no one ever did this. Obviously, people have and sometimes still do. This is something that happened, but there were a lot of exaggerated accounts of people that were being cannibals. So it's something you have to remember when, you know, when people are describing others and when people are getting all upset. We often, you know, we let our words get really big about our enemies. And sometimes you have to watch out with that because they don't correspond to reality. So, like I said, I usually emphasize that we can read the textbook and most of what it says is true. But in this case, I wanted to sort of caution you about this flourish of ending the chapter with cannibalism and letting it go without any sort of comment about that. How are we doing?